Well, this morning, we're looking at one of the most interesting people that most people have never heard of. He's one of the most significant American thinkers, period. Life magazine, back in the day, listed him as one of the top 12 or 15 intellectuals in the country. Howard Thurman. And it's really a shame, actually. I taught at Colgate Rochester Divinity School, where he was for a while. It was actually a decisive experience for him. And nobody mentioned him the whole time I was there. He's not part of their legacy, which is amazing to me, actually, because he said that his time at Colgate Rochester was absolutely decisive for the shaping of his career. So he's one of these people that you may hear about indirectly, but I think it's really worth getting to know him. So that's one reason I pick people in this series, is to highlight people we might not otherwise be paying attention to. Howard Thurman's dates are 1899 to 1981, so he lived a very long and fruitful life. He was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, and you can imagine what it was like to be born in Daytona Beach, Florida in 1899, right? So his grandmother was actually born a slave and lived in slavery until she was freed by the Civil War. And she, if you will, gave him religion. That's his, he caught religion from his grandmother. And so we'll talk more about that as we go along. But his grandmother became increasingly important because when Thurman was 7, his father died. And so his mother, his father had a very good living, so they had a very nice home and everything in one of the Black communities near Daytona Beach. Close enough to the beach that he could walk the beach. But his grandmother moved in with them so his mother could work. And so his grandmother became a very important influence on his life. And we'll talk especially about something she told him down the line. One of the things she did tell him, though, was when she was young, when his grandmother was younger, the white girl in the plantation where she was a slave started to teach her how to read. She started to teach her the alphabet. And her mother found out she was teaching a slave how to read and beat her badly and told her never to do that again. And his grandmother told Howard, learn how to read, study. There's something in it that scares them. And so that's what he did. He was a voracious reader. He read everything he could get his hands on. Obviously, he learned how to read. And he was a brilliant, brilliant man. There's no question about it. So after growing up in that area, there's another thing that happens in that area that's extremely important. Howard Thurman called himself a mystic, which is interesting because the civil rights leaders all drew on Howard Thurman's thought, especially a book called Jesus and the Disinherited, which we'll be looking at selections of this morning. But his religious life, really, he was what one would call a nature mystic. So when he was young, growing up in a very oppressive situation in South Florida, a very alienating, disinherited life, to use his phrase, with his back against the wall, as he would put it. He would go for long walks on the Atlantic shore at night, and he would, especially on a clear night, and he would have this experience of the unity of all things. He said the stars, you could just reach up and touch them, and the surf is crashing off to the side, so it has that tremendous rhythm to it. And so his first experiences of God were in nature, especially along the Atlantic shore, but also in the forests of the area. And then importantly, there was a huge oak tree in the backyard of their home. And when he was young, he used to go sit against the oak tree with his back against the oak tree and talk to it, right? And we think that's kind of charming, but he actually, late in life, in an interview, he says, I just read the most interesting thing about the prayer life of elephants. And he said, and monkeys also have a prayer life, that there are times of the day when all the monkeys will gather up in the top of the tree and seem to salute the sun as it's setting. And so for him, talking to a tree was the most natural thing in the world because he had this intuition from a very early age that all life, not just human life, all life is one, right? All life is one. Trees, animals, human beings of all sorts, etc. And so that experience when he was a very, very young person stayed with him his whole life. And what's interesting is that often when he would go to Christian worship, that's the last thing he would experience, right? So his question became, how does one cultivate that relationship in the Christian community? But there was another thing his grandmother told him, we'll talk about that later. Well, he did in fact learn how to read and educate himself, if you will, and wound up going to a segregated Baptist school in Jacksonville, Florida, and graduated valedictorian. So he went to Morehouse College as an undergraduate, and it said that he read every book in the library while he was there. And I think he graduated valedictorian. Yes, he did valedictorian from Morehouse, which was predominantly Black school. And then but he graduated with a degree in economics. And as I said, he's a very wide-ranging person that way. Then he decided that he was really a religious person and ministry was his calling. So he went to Rochester Divinity School in Rochester, New York. And while he was there, they admitted 2 Black students a year, and everyone else was white, and they're all men, right? This is in the 20s. And they had 2 rooms set apart for the Blacks, right? That no one else could stay in because there was that view of contagion. When I was in South Bend, when they let Black people swim in the public pool, after they were done swimming in it, they drained it, right? Because it's just absolutely defiled and we can't swim in that. So it was a similar idea. Rochester admitted Black students, which was amazing, but they were, in their own rooms. And across the hall from his room were 2 white students in a 3-room suite. And Thurman had never interacted with white people. He said he just didn't want to draw the attention of white people because it never went well, right? And so he's kept to himself in his world, his own world on the beach and in nature, and then in the Black community, but he never had anything to do with white people whatsoever. And these 2 white seminarians said, why don't you come live in our room? It's much more comfortable than your little single room there. And he's like, I just had to sit there and think, what am I getting myself into? And so he spent 3 years living with 2 other white men at the seminary, and he said that was absolutely transformative to him. That it was a boundary he was living with that had been created for him, and that he was living within. But when he stepped outside that boundary, he learned all sorts of things about the unity of life, if you will. And so this is the theme of his whole theology, is that we underestimate the power of unity, we underestimate the power of the unity of all life, and we're constantly creating comfort zones we live in for very good reasons, by the way. Avoiding getting the you-know-what knocked out of you is a very good reason to avoid being with white people. But when he did allow himself to be with these 2 white people in a predominantly white seminary, it was a transformative experience for him. And really, at the end of his career at Boston University, it's a predominantly white university, and he was the head of the chapel there. And on the faculty of theology there. So this transition at Rochester Divinity School was incredibly important for him. The next major moment for him was when he became he was an American Baptist, and he became a pastor of a church in Oberlin, Ohio. And during the time he was there, he took time off from his pastorate, like a sabbatical, to do a semester of graduate study at Haverford College. And he studied with the Quaker theologian Rufus M Jones. And Jones had recovered George Fox as a mystical theologian. And he is, actually, if you've ever read Fox's diary, he's a mystical theologian. And so Rufus Jones wanted to recover the mysticism of George Fox for contemporary Quakers. He also succeeded, by the way, in healing the rupture in the Quaker community that happened in the 19th century. So they reunited, I think, after Jones' time, but his work was absolutely fundamental. So you see, again, focus on the interior life, unifying division, right? So Jones was very, very important for Howard Thurman's own work because he intentionally cultivated the interior life that Howard Thurman had kind of stumbled on the beach of the Atlantic. So Jones was very, very important, and Thurman said it changed his life completely. He returned to Morehouse College as a professor, and then he was head of the chapel at Howard University. And then while he was there, he went to India for several months with a group of other pastors, and he met Mohandas Gandhi. And he had an audience with Gandhi. And Gandhi, there are 2 stories that Thurman tells. I think the second one is the more accurate one. He says that in his book, he says he met somebody in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, as we would call it now. who asked him these questions. In an interview toward the end of his life, he said it was Gandhi who asked him these questions. So they had this audience with Gandhi, they went into the tent with him, and Gandhi said to him, I have just one question for you. You're a Christian, right? And you're African American, actually would say black. And he said, yes. And of course, Gandhi was a person of color as well, right? And he said, how can you do this? How you're betraying all dark-skinned people in the world. He said, you know, Christians sailed over to Africa and enslaved people. Christians sailed them across the Atlantic like cords of wood and sold them, the survivors, when they got here. Christians bought the slaves and used them as slaves on their plantations, and then worshiped separately from the slaves in their lives. When the slaves were freed in the Civil War, they were freed by a president who was not really Christian, which is true. Abraham Lincoln was not Christian. Gandhi thought that was significant. And then the Christians are now lynching your people, and they're setting fire to you, and they go to church, and then they go to a lynching, and they write it up in the newspaper. He said, you're a betrayer of dark people everywhere. How can you, why aren't you a Muslim? Muslims talk about the unity of all human life. Christians don't. Christians are like slave owners. And Thurman, this really struck him, right? And it led to a question, why do I feel devotion to Jesus? How can I feel devotion to Jesus, given this history? I think it's really interesting. The first, in the book, he doesn't tell you it's Gandhi. In the interview, he said it was, but it's a very profound encounter. And I think it really shaped Thurman's response to the way he thought about that. So we'll talk about that in a sec. He returned back to Howard, and then in 1944, he went out to San Francisco to help found the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. And this gives you an idea of Thurman's life. It's the first congregation in the United States to be interracial and interfaith. So they had Black, white, Asian, Hispanic people there, and they had Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Christians there, and atheists, right? Because for Thurman, the moment of worship is a unitive thing. Right? Worship is meant to bring people together. Worship is meant to expose the unity we all have in our relationship with the Creator. And his disgust with Christian worship is it does not do that. First of all, it's segregated denominationally, it's segregated religiously. So, if you're a Jew, you don't come here, etc. And then it's segregated racially. I think it's still true that the most segregated hour in America is Sunday morning. Right? And so for him, this was incredibly problematic. But notice, it's not just racially problematic for him, it's also religiously problematic. He thought that we were living with divisions that didn't have to be there. So he's very much a universalist in that sense, the universal religious experience. Well, then he was hired back to Boston University, which was predominantly white university, as the dean of the chapel, and I believe he also had a faculty position in the School of Theology there. And then he retired from there, moved back to San Francisco, and directed the Howard Thurman Educational Trust, which funded especially minority students in their education. So you can see for him, his grandmother's advice was really near and dear to him, and he spent the last years of his life doing that. He also authored more than 20 books, really an amazing person. The best thing to do, though, is there are 2 YouTube interviews with him that he did late in his life, and they're unbelievably interesting. And you have to hear him in order to understand him, I think. So just to watch the way he speaks and the way he thinks is really quite remarkable. So I have to say those 2, it's a 2-part interview that was really amazing. Well, the readings that I picked for today come first from his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which was his attempt to answer Gandhi's question, right? Why would an oppressed, disinherited person turn to Jesus when the people who acted in Jesus' name were the ones who enslaved and abused you so horribly? And then secondly, how does one combine, or how does one understand mysticism that doesn't lead to social withdrawal and quietism, right? So how is a mystic active in the world? Because that's the usual canard about mystics, right? Is that they retreat from the world, they don't care about social injustice, they don't care about the suffering of their neighbor. And he was horrified by this thought because that never occurred to him, right? So he wrote this book called, article called Mysticism and Ethics. It's really succinct, gets right at the way he saw things. So that'll be where the second material comes from. But there's a paragraph, I probably should have put at the very top. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. It's in the second third of the reading from the first page. He says that you can hear his own experience in this, but also you can hear Gandhi's question. He says, for years it has been part of my own quest, so to understand the religion of Jesus, that interest in his way of life could be developed and sustained by intelligent men and women who were at the same time deeply victimized by the Christian church's betrayal of his faith. Now notice what he says there. It isn't faith in Jesus, it's betrayal of Jesus's faith, right? And so he's making a transition. He's like Karl Barth's worst nightmare in some ways, because he's talking about Jesus not as an object of our faith, but Jesus as a subject who is religious, right? So that's the way he realized that in growing up, what he was interested in and what moved him was Jesus and Jesus's relationship with God and the way Jesus taught people to relate to each other. What did not move him was faith in Jesus Christ, right? And so and this comes out from his grandmother. His grandmother had him read to her, which is really smart because it was also helping him develop his reading skills. And she would have him read from the New Testament, but she always wanted him to read from the Gospels, never from the letters of Paul. And that's because when she was a child growing up a slave, the white preachers would come to the church, the chapel where they were, and they would read Paul, slaves obey your masters, etc. And they would tell them, if you obey your masters, you will in fact, it will not really be a picnic in this life, but you'll be blessed by God and you'll inherit eternal life and you'll be eternally happy in heaven. And she would have nothing to do with Paul as a consequence. So I think that this distinction between Paul and Jesus is actually operating all the time in Thurman's thinking. And so Paul worships Jesus Christ, Jesus worships God the Creator and the God of Israel. And so that's the major distinction he's going to make. And then in the second paragraph, you can see the same thing. He said, it is a privilege after so long a time to set down what seems to me to be an essentially creative and prognostic interpretation of Jesus as a religious subject rather than religious object. It is necessary to examine the religion of Jesus, in other words, Jesus' religion, against the background of his own age and people, and to inquire into the content of his teaching with reference to the disinherited and the underprivileged. And what he points out, and then he has this great phrase right at the beginning, the significance of the religion of Jesus, but that I sort of started with different quotes to get the religion of Jesus. In other words, the religious life of Jesus, not Jesus as an object of religious life. The religion of Jesus to people who stand with their backs against the wall. Right? And there's a documentary that was made about Howard Thurman called Backs Against the Wall. Even late in life, he would use this phrase. What does Jesus have to say to people who are disinherited, who are dispossessed, who are in a sense stateless and homeless even in their own country, and who have their backs against the wall? In other words, they have nowhere to turn. Right? What does he have to say to them? And so that's what the book Jesus and the Disinherited is about. And you may have heard of it because Martin Luther King was a student of Howard Thurman's at Boston University and carried around Jesus and the Disinherited, especially during the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. But I think it depends on whom you ask. He was carrying it the rest of his life. King's father was a student with Thurman at Morehouse. And so Martin Luther King Jr. thought of Howard Thurman as like an old man. He's like my dad's age, you know. So he did not view him as a kind of contemporary at all, but he did view him as a spiritual guy. And Jesus and the Disinherited was, and Jesse Jackson says the same thing, that it was, and John Lewis, this book was deeply formative of their own understanding of what they were doing. Even though Thurman wasn't out on the streets, he wasn't a marcher or protester or anything like that, but the book was incredibly important. So what he wants us to see, though, is that Jesus himself is disinherited. This is actually a much more common view now. He wrote this book in 1949, I think it was. Yeah, 1949. And there's a great review in a New Testament journal that says, I really doubt anyone's going to find much of interest in the New Testament about seeing Jesus in light of the disinherited. Well, that proved not to be very thoughtful, right? But very condescending, like incredibly condescending. And now it's normative to read the life of Jesus in light of this question of the disinherited. And so it's really interesting. He was way ahead of the game. And actually, he may have contributed to the game by writing this book. But the three things he points out about Jesus that he finds absolutely essential are, the first is Jesus is a Jew, right? Jesus is Jewish. This is emphatically important to him. And Christianity, he thinks, forgotten, right? But he's a Jew in a society that basically doesn't view Jews very favorably. In other words, they're kind of disinherited. So he's initially disinherited in the Roman Empire because the Romans aren't thrilled about the Jews. They weren't especially hostile to them initially, but they became increasingly hostile to Jews, and vice versa. The second thing, and this is in some ways as or more important, he's a poor Jew, right? He's a poor Jew from Galilee, 2 strikes. And one of the things he discovers about Paul that he doesn't like is that Paul's a Roman citizen, right? And so when Paul is beginning to be persecuted by his own people, he appeals to Caesar because he's a Roman citizen. He has tremendous backup, right? That's why he winds up going to Rome. He appeals his case and they send him to Rome. So Thurman says, you throw Paul in the ditch, you're going to be dealing with Caesar. You throw Jesus in the ditch, he's just a Jew in a ditch, right? And the Romans would probably kick him if they saw him in the ditch. Whereas Paul is like, I'm a Roman citizen. So it's an interesting point. I don't know if it completely works, but it's certainly worth thinking about. So he's a Jew, he's a poor Jew, and he's not a Roman citizen, and the Romans are occupying this country. And so he's disinherited in terms of the power structure. The power structure is against himself and his people. And so you don't want to draw the attention of Rome toward you, because we know what happens when Rome directs its attention to you, you wind up getting crucified, which is what happened to him, right? So if you read the New Testament, if you read the Gospels with this point of view, then you are looking for what, if I'm a person with my back against the wall, what is Jesus saying to me to help me survive, right? How do I survive in this situation as a Jew, a poor Jew, with Romans as a hostile occupying power? This would be very similar to the experience in our country today of people of color and the police. You don't want to get the attention of the police because it's not going to go well. So you don't want to get the attention of the Roman authorities because it's usually not going to go well. So that's a real parallel he saw with being Black in this country. Yeah. And actually, so the point was that writing a book about Jesus would be that he would look at people in situations of adversity, right? And then tell them that God cares for them. God is concerned with them individually.
But not only that, he listens.
Right, he would listen. That's right. I'm sorry, I forgot that part. He listens to what they say.
That your life means something to me.
No, that's Howard Thurman. That's Howard Thurman in a nutshell. So he says, but he's also, for Thurman, there's more to it than that, but there is that. It's that Jesus is aware of the bad direction your life can take as a disinherited person. And that's what's going to kill you. What's going to kill you is not being disinherited. What's going to kill you is how your heart or your spirit reacts, understandably, reacts to being disinherited, right? And so he says in the third paragraph, there is one overmastering problem, and this is picking very much up on your idea. There's one overmastering problem that the socially and politically disinherited always face. Under what terms is survival possible? Jesus recognized fully that out of the heart are the issues of life, and no external force, however great and overwhelming, can at long last destroy a people if it does not first win the victory of the spirit against them. And no one can do that to you, only you do that to yourself, right? So the victory is in the spirit and the victory is in your heart. And the defeat would be if the disinheritors get you to have a bad heart, an evil heart. And then he says, paraphrasing Jesus, to revile because one has been reviled. This is the real evil because it is the evil of the soul itself. So if the Romans revile you, don't revile in return, because being reviled is not the evil, reviling in return is the evil, right? Jesus saw this with almighty clarity. So that would be your point about his uniqueness,
If
right?
you revile back, you only get in trouble.
Well, and you'll also destroy yourself. So you're destroying yourself. And again, he came back to the inner life of the individual. And this is different from the way Jesus is often portrayed now. With increasing insight and startling accuracy, he placed his finger on the inward center as the crucial arena where the issues would determine the destiny of his people. So it's about the heart of the individual that it's focused on. And he's thinking of him, he's reading this obviously in light of his own experience. What allowed him to live in a culture and a social context in which he was nothing, in fact, in which he was worse than nothing. It's the sense he had from a very young age that the creator of the universe created me. The creator of the universe created me, and I am one with all the life the creator created. And so when he reads the New Testament, he hears Jesus saying exactly the same thing. Not one sparrow falls without the will of God knowing it, right? And you are of much more worth than the sparrow. So he's telling people that so that they see in their inward center, if you will, in the most inward part of who they are, that's where God is. That's where they find God in their connection to the Creator. And if you hold to that, nothing anyone does can destroy you. If you let go of that, there are any number of things you can do that will destroy you. So what was his role, especially in the civil rights movement? You have all these people who are very famous as civil rights leaders who are appealing to him, but he was not a civil rights leader, right? I don't think temperamentally that was his thing. He's a mystic, right? And so he's focused on this inward life, the hunger of the heart. That's one of his favorite phrases, the hunger. And he thinks all creatures have a hunger of the heart for the Creator. And that's why elephants pray, and that's why monkeys pray, and this dog would go up and look at the sunset, etc. So he thought God put his seal on every creature, and every creature longed for God. Every creature hungered for God. So that was the focus. And if you follow that hunger out, it leads to the overcoming of any conceivable division. Not that it overcomes them, right? So it doesn't immediately overcome them, but if you let go of that vision, then every division matters. If you hold that vision, no division matters. It's there, but it's an obstacle that can be overcome. And so you can see exactly why King and others would be inspired by Thurman, because of his vision of unity that's beyond all contradiction, all division. The other thing they learned from him was when he was in India, he learned nonviolent resistance from Gandhi. I neglected to bring that up and brought that back and taught it. And that's nonviolent resistance was the method that the African Americans used in the civil rights struggle. But your point is still a good one, that he was outside, he was in that and outside of it, because he was not a part of any party. Right? When he writes Jesus and the Disinherited, he's leading the church in San Francisco that's this interfaith, interreligious, interracial community. So for him, that's the work. The work is worship that includes everyone, right? Worship that brings everyone to discover in themselves, not in me, not in the community, in yourself, the source of dignity and the source of integrity and the source of love and the source of hope that nothing in the universe can take away from you, because it's the creator of the universe that you find there, right? And so in a way, the civil rights movement was, it was incredibly important to him. He was certainly not on the side of the segregationists, but he wasn't on anyone's side. Because that's, again, we take sides, then we're back into this whole thing, and that's not Jesus, right? Love your enemy. Who's the enemy? The worst enemy of the Jews, and he's not wrong about this, were the tax collectors. Because they're collaborating with the Roman authorities and fleecing the poor people already, because the tax collector could charge anything he wanted and they got rewarded there was no tax rate. You just got what you could. And so they're fleecing their own people who are already being oppressed. And Jesus, who invites them, who to have dinner with them? Tax collectors, right? And he heals a Roman centurion's son. Or slave, even worse. He heals a slave of a Roman centurion. So for Jesus does not live within boundaries, right? Because even though he's a Jew and he's a very devout Jew, and Thurman thinks it was a horrible thing that Christianity lost its touch with Israel. It's never left Israel in that sense. But yeah, so he's not, he wants every individual to descend in themselves the way he did and go deep, deep, deep into your, what he calls meanness. And then he laughed, he said, I don't mean meanness, I mean meanness. What is it that makes me me? What makes me irreducibly individual, right? So I'm not just a civil rights leader, or I'm not just a mystic or something. What is it about me that makes me me? And if I really, and he goes, if you really dig down into that, and you just keep pressing and pressing, what is it that makes me me? You discover the creator of the universe. And suddenly you go way down in yourself and you come up inside every living thing. You go into yourself and you come up inside every living thing. So he's also an environmentalist, right? So we're not paying any attention to our unity with all forms of life. By the way, we process sugar in exactly the same way trees do. Exactly the same way. Life is one. It's not, and he would read stuff like this, okay? But what we tend to do is we go this way. I relate directly to you. He said, this is what politicians do, this is what sociologists do, this is what philosophers tend to do. We relate to each other directly, and then we beat each other up. Because I'm not drawing from what makes me me, and therefore I'm not triggering what makes you you. Right? And so I can treat you in such a way that it takes away your dignity, and it takes away your autonomy, and it takes away your you-ness. And you can try to make, I can try to make you, without even trying, indebted to me. Right? And he talks about how charity does that. We give things to people, and now they're objects of our charity, and we make them dependent on us. He says, no, no, no. What you want to do is to develop, help them develop their relationship with the creator, which you don't even know. The only person who can discover that is that person. You can help them do that, but only when we tap into that relationship, can we in fact love, and can we have any hope. In fact, he even points out that the word hope comes from the relationship of a lagoon to the ocean. And the hope is the channel, it's often hidden, that allows, it's sometimes called a lacuna too, that allows the lagoon to flow into the ocean and the ocean to flow into the lagoon. And so hope is based on this sense that my life flows from and into the creator, and therefore is one with all creation. Right, so in a sense, he's more individualistic than the civil rights movement was, because he wants every person to dig deep and find out what makes me me. And then on the other hand, he's more universal than the civil rights movement, even though again, he's very sympathetic with it, no question about it. He's more universal in that it's all life. It's not just human life, it's all life. And the vision he had, but this does go with that version of the civil rights movement. The vision he had was increasing reconciliation. Because given who the creator is and given what life is, reconciliation is the thing that wins, and everything that tries to stop it loses, right? Life will find a way, is what they say in Jurassic Park, right? But he's absolutely convinced of that. If you're against the creator of the universe, your odds aren't very good, right? But in the short term, it could go very badly. The visions can be really bad. No, thank you for that. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's his point. See, is that this experience is categorically universal. This is what it means to be a human being. And so he was not at all surprised to see religious life in all of its diverse forms coming with the same awareness, right? Although my favorite term in the Native American traditions is the great mysterious, right? So it's not the great spirit, it's the great mysterious. So there's a sense that the source of all life is infinitely mysterious. But Thurman would say, absolutely, that's why there were Native Americans in his church in San Francisco. On the other hand, so thank you for that, because that's exactly his point. He would look for this everywhere. And he'd say, you know, I have this sense of what makes me me, and that gives me a sniffer. And he said, when I meet somebody, I'm on the lookout for that. I'm on the lookout for that. And sometimes I'm not very good at sensing it. And so I need to work on my sniffer, right? So spiritual discipline is working on the sniffer. So when you meet a Muslim, he was very interested in that. When you meet a Jew, he was very interested in that. On the other hand, so it sounds like he wanted kind of a universal fellowship, but he has a profound appreciation for what a particular tradition can do. Because he says, the view of universal redemption came out of Israel during the prophetic era. And Israel is this teeny little country, insulated in its practice from its surrounding culture. It's not this all borders are gone kind of culture. It's focused like a laser on its relationship with Yahweh, good and bad, right? It can go badly. It's focused on its practices, it's focused on its beliefs, etc. And yet by digging deep into their identity as the Jewish people, they discover the creator of the universe, right? The one God who is the God of everything. So in a way, that's who we are. Even if we just go individually, we have a particularity that's unique to us. And there's nothing damaging to him. So picking up on that, as long as in the context in which we find ourselves, we keep digging until we find the source of all life. But you can see that. I mean, I've had that same experience in other cultures as well. We call them primitive, but of course he said that was a mistake, right? Because they actually oftentimes have more of a sense of what life is about than we do. Well, there's one that picks up on something Beth said. There's one thing I want to make sure I get in, because it really changed Howard Thurman's life with regard to this question. And that has to do with something his grandmother told him when he was growing up. When she was young, I mentioned that they had worship and the white preacher would come and tell them that they were slaves and they should obey their masters. That's why she hated the Apostle Paul. But every now and then, there was a minister, I think he came twice a year, who was a slave. So he was one of them. And when he came, he would preach on different things, so it wasn't the same sermon. That happens. We do know there are people who preach the same sermon no matter what. But no matter what the sermon was that he preached, at the end of the sermon, he would stop. And there would be this pregnant pause. And he would look each of them in the eye and say, you are not niggers. You are not slaves. You are God's children, right? And he would say that each time, and it transformed her life, and it transformed his life. He's like, and that goes to your point, that's how they survived slavery, was remembering they're not niggers, they're not slaves, they're God's children. So if you penetrate down to that point, it doesn't matter what anyone else calls you. It doesn't matter how much anyone else hates you. It doesn't matter how much anyone else wants you to be afraid of them. You won't be afraid of them, you'll be afraid of God. Right? You should be afraid of God, you should fear God. You won't hate them, you will love them in return, and you won't lie, because one of the ways we avoid being persecuted is to deceive people. We'll tell the truth because our integrity is our life, right? So you'll be honest. And he says the three things that disinherited people do to survive is they fear their enemies, they lie to them, and they hate them. And Jesus knew that would happen because he was disinherited himself. And so he insisted, fear God, not anyone else. Tell the truth, no matter if it kills you, and it did, and love, even if you have every reason to hate, right? And all three are the same thing, just from different views. So in that sense, it isn't, and this I think is really interesting, it's not enough to tell the disinherited God loves you, because you could say, oh yeah, and I hate the people doing this to me, and I'm terrified of them, and I'm gonna lie to them every opportunity I get. So there's a problem being disinherited creates in the soul that's toxic. And Jesus saw that because he was disinherited himself. And so the life of the soul is overcoming our fear of others so that we fear only God, overcoming our lying so that we have integrity, and overcoming our hatred so that we actually love, right? But there are a million reasons, and in the book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he gives them why disinherited people lie, why they hate, why they're afraid. And so he's not saying they're wrong psychologically, it's just that they have to win the battle of the spirit over against that. But I thought I think that quote that his grandmother drove into him was really powerful. I mean, you can imagine, that's after hearing, so imagine the contrast. You get the white minister coming in saying, slaves obey your masters. And then he comes in and says, you are not a slave, you are not a nigger, you are God's child. And who does he sound like? Thurman would say, Jesus. Who does the other guy sound like? Well, we'd say Deutero-Pauline, but it's still in the Pauline line. Yeah, so what does fear, and so it doesn't mean being afraid, right? But it does in a way, because you fear the disapproval of God, right? And that acts as a restraining, that acts as a principle that goes through your life in terms of your integrity. Because we talk all the time. I mean, what he's doing is he's saying, if you have a relationship with the Creator, then that is a claim on you, right? The Creator belongs to you. You belong to the Creator. And so fear is realizing that. It's more, probably better translated reverence, but it's also fear, right? So it means that you're taking that seriously, that the Creator is looking at you, and you are now to look at the Creator and not at anyone else, right? Even when other people are trying to scare you half to death and to get you to corrupt your soul by means of that fear. So yeah, he's old-fashioned that way because we don't like talking that way. I think it's kind of a loss because we go on and on and on about how God loves us, and he certainly thought that was important. But what he's doing with overcoming fear, overcoming lying, and overcoming hatred is working on us, and that's what we don't like talking about. We don't like talking about how we are the obstacle to what should be going on. And so, but yeah, we could talk more about the fear thing as we go. Well, anyway, so there are some wonderful quotes. I just wanted to end with the one that's really at the heart of his theology. It's on page, and then I should end because Karen's probably going to rush the stage at this point. But this quote comes from his book Mysticism and Ethics, and it really is Thurman at the end of the day. It's the second quote on page 2. There is a core of aloneness at the heart of living. There are thresholds before which all people stop. Only God may tread, and even God in disguise. Each soul must learn how to be independent of all secondary relations and involvements. We walk a part of the way together, but on the upper reaches, each path leads to the heights alone. Ultimately, I am alone, so vastly alone that in my aloneness is all the life of the universe. That's an amazing sentence. In such moments of profound awareness, I seem to be all that there is in the universe, and all that there is seems to be I. In the mystic's moment of fontal unity, and that's one of his favorite phrases, all divisions, all tensions are resolved. Only the vision, only the experience itself is the reality. And yet this is not an accurate statement of what transpires. The experience of unity is a breakdown of awareness that transcends experience, but this does not last, right? So that's the fire of his life, right? That vision. And then how do we go about cultivating that? How do we go about lighting that in other people, et cetera? That's really the goal. And so it's a different task in that way than the civil rights movement per se. It's obviously related to it, but it really is something. I just love that I am alone, so vastly alone that in my aloneness is all the life of the universe. It's just really remarkable. Anyway, thank you for your patience. Great questions. Yes, thank you very much.